はい、始めます。今日は一番すごかった悪魔のトリックは、彼が今までこの世に存在しなかったと確信させたことだっていう言葉です。これあれかな推理番組っていうか、そういう番組やね。一番すごかった悪魔のトリックは、彼が今までにこの世に存在しなかったっていうのを確信させたことだって、刑事さんか誰かが言ってます。で、英文的には、The greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he didn't exist って言ってます。はい。The greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convince the world he didn't exist. デビルが悪魔、プルはトリック。プルアトリックで汚い手を使う。コンバインスが確信させるとか説得させるですね。で、コメントを拾うと、これはめっちゃ言いやすかったです。やはりよく使う単語表現は言いやすいんだな。前の表現にかかる説ってリスニングむずいな。そんな感じですね。はい。で、ちょっと、英語を勉強します。The greatest trick で、すごいトリックだみたいなこと言ってますね。これ多分、The greatest trick の後に関係代名詞が入るよね。その、The greatest trick を、その後ろの文が説明してるみたいな感じだと思います。The greatest trick 最もすごかったトリック。The devil ever pulled 悪魔がやったすごいトリック。was は、combines the world he didn't exist 世界に彼が今まで存在しなかったっていうのを世界に確信させたことだみたいな感じだね。そんな感じですね。The greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he didn't exist. The greatest trick the devil ever pulled was the world convincing the world he didn't exist. Okay. The greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he didn't exist. OK。じゃあ、聞いていきます。greatest trick the ever pulled was convincing the world he didn't exist. ちょっとゆっくり聞いていきます。一番最初のザが聞こえへんかったわ。Devil ever pulled. OK。一番最初のザが聞こえへんな。そういうもんなんかな。Greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he didn't exist. Greatest trick the devil ever pulled was... OK。Greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he didn't exist. was convincing the world he didn't exist. Was convincing the world he didn't exist. He didn't exist. Was convincing the world he didn't exist. He didn't exist. Was convincing the world he didn't exist. Ouch. Greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he didn't exist. Greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he didn't exist. Greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he didn't exist. Greatest trick the devil ever pulled was... あれGreatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he didn't exist. Greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he didn't exist. Greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he didn't exist. Greatest world the devil あかん。Greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he didn't exist. Greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he didn't exist. Greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he didn't exist. Greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he didn't exist. Greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he didn't exist. Greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he didn't exist. Greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convinced that he didn't exist. Convinced the world he didn't exist. ちょっと後ろの文を重点的にやってみよう。Greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convinced the world he didn't exist. Greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convinced the world he didn't exist. Was convincing the world he didn't exist. Was convincing the world he didn't exist. Was convincing the world he didn't exist. Okay. Greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he didn't exist. Greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world. Greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the Greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the devil ever pulled. Greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he didn't exist. OK, ちょっと覚えてきた。Greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he didn't exist. Greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world that he didn't exist. Greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he didn't exist. The greatest world... Oh. Greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he didn't exist. Greatest trick the devil ever pulled... Greatest trick the... Greatest trick の後のザ・デビルのザもちっちゃく言ってるわ。Greatest trick devil ever Paul was convinced as well he didn't exist. Greatest trick the devil ever Paul that convinced the world he didn't exist. Greatest trick. Oh. Greatest trick the devil ever Paul was convinced the world he didn't exist. Greatest trick the devil ever Paul was convinced the world he didn't exist. Greatest was oh. Greatest trick oh. Greatest trick the Greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he didn't exist. 今の良かった。Greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he didn't exist. Greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he didn't exist. Greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he didn't exist. Greatest trick he didn't あれ Greatest trick the devil ever pulled oh. Greatest trick that ever devil oh. あかん。Greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he didn't exist. Okay. The greatest trick. Oh. Greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he didn't exist. Greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he didn't exist. 広告だ。Greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he didn't exist. Greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he didn't exist. Greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he didn't exist. The greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he didn't exist. Greatest は、あれ。Greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he did. あら。Greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he didn't exist. Greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he didn't exist. Greatest あ、convincing the world he didn't exist こんな感じやね。Greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he didn't exist. Greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he didn't exist. Greatest trick the devil ever pulled was あれGreatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he didn't exist. Greatest trick the devil ever pulled was あれ Greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he didn't exist. Greatest trick he did あれGreatest trick greatest trick the devil ever pulled was, あれ greatest trick ちょっと見ていいよ。あかんわ。greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he didn't exist. Greatest trick the devil ever pulled was greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he didn't exist. Greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he didn't exist. Greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he didn't exist. Greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he didn't exist. Greatest trick the devil ever pulled, Greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he didn't exist. Greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he didn't exist. The greatest trick the devil なんか、むずい。The greatest trick the devil ever pulled was, むずい。Greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he didn't exist. Greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he didn't exist. Greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he didn't exist. Greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he didn't exist. Greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he didn't exist. Greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he didn't exist. Greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he didn't exist. この漢字か。Greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he didn't exist. Greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he didn't exist. Greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he didn't exist. Greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he didn't exist. 今の漢字や。終わったわ。ちょっと、難しかったっていうか、リズムが独特やった。なんか、主語が長いっていうかさ、それでなんか頭が追いついてませんでしたね。で、今日の文章は、一番すごかった悪魔のトリックは、彼が今までこの世に存在しなかったっていうのを確信させたことだ。The greatest trick the devil, 忘れた。The greatest trick the devil ever pulled was, 忘れた。コンバインスか。The greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he didn't exist です。で、それ早く言ってて、ザが聞こえへんかった、最初。greatest trick he did, greatest trick, great, 言えへん。greatest trick the devil ever pulled was, greatest trick,あかんわ。greatest trick the devil ever pulled was, greatest trick the devil ever pulled was, greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he didn't exist みたいな感じで言ってましたね。そんな感じです。お疲れ様です。